They said it was a tragic accident. They said she was hormonal, clumsy, and emotionally unstable. But gravity doesn't take sides, and neither do security cameras. When Natalie Pierce tumbled down 24 marble steps at the San Francisco Superior Court, her husband, Greg, didn't scream for help. He looked at his watch. He thought he had committed the perfect crime in broad daylight, with his mistress, Tiffany, standing right there as the only witness. But Greg forgot one thing. Natalie wasn't just a housewife. She was the little sister of Harrison Brooks, the most ruthless criminal defense attorney in the state, and he was about to turn their lives into a living hell. This is the story of how a push down the stairs woke up a sleeping giant. The air inside the San Francisco Superior Court smelled like floor wax and anxiety. It was a Tuesday, typically a slow day for family court, but for Natalie Pierce, it felt like the end of the world. Natalie was 7 months pregnant. She sat on a wooden bench outside courtroom 304, her hands resting protectively over her swollen belly. She looked exhausted. Her blonde hair, usually kept in a pristine blowout, was pulled back in a messy bun, and her eyes were rimmed with red. She wore a simple maternity dress that felt too tight around the ribs. Standing 10 feet away, leaning against a pillar and scrolling through his phone, was her husband, Greg Pierce. Greg was the golden boy of Silicon Valley real estate. He was handsome in that sharp, manufactured way, perfect teeth, a $5,000 Navy suit, and a jawline that looked like it could cut glass. He didn't look like a man who was divorcing his pregnant wife. He looked like a man waiting for an Uber. And then there was her, Tiffany Cole. Tiffany wasn't supposed to be here. That was the agreement. Greg's lawyer had explicitly stated that third parties would remain outside the courthouse to keep tensions low. But Tiffany didn't do subtle. She was 24, a former fitness influencer turned lifestyle consultant, wearing a white bodycon dress that looked more appropriate for a cocktail party than a divorce hearing. She stood right next to Greg, whispering something in his ear that made him smirk. Natalie felt bile rise in her throat. "Greg," she called out, her voice trembling slightly. "Can you please ask her to wait downstairs? You promised." Greg didn't even look up from his phone. "It's a public building, Nat. She has a right to be here. Stop being dramatic. This is why we're here, isn't it? Your constant drama." "I'm not being dramatic," Natalie said, struggling to stand up. Her lower back throbbed. "I'm asking for basic respect. She's the reason we're getting divorced, Greg. Having her here, while we discuss custody of our unborn child, is cruel." Tiffany turned then, flipping her long, dark hair over her shoulder. She looked at Natalie with a gaze that wasn't just cold, it was amused. "Relax, Natalie. Stress is bad for the baby, or so I've read. I wouldn't know, obviously, since Greg and I are careful." The cruelty of the comment took Natalie's breath away. She grabbed her purse and walked toward the elevators, needing to get away from them before the bailiff called their names. "I'm going to the restroom," she muttered. "Run away," Greg called after her, like always. The elevators were taking too long. The little arrow was stuck on the 4th floor. Desperate for air, Natalie pushed open the heavy door to the stairwell. It was a grand, old-fashioned staircase. Marble steps, steep and echoing. She just needed to get down one flight to the vending machines, to get water. She felt dizzy. She took the first step, gripping the handrail. The heavy door behind her hissed open again. Natalie froze. She didn't turn around, but she could smell the perfume. Chanel Chance. Sickeningly sweet. "You know you're not going to win, right?" Tiffany's voice echoed in the concrete stairwell. It sounded distorted, predatory. Natalie turned slowly. Tiffany was standing at the top of the landing, alone. Greg wasn't there. "Go away, Tiffany." "Greg doesn't want the kid, Natalie," Tiffany said, taking a step down. Her heels clicked sharply on the stone. "He feels bad for you, sure. But a baby? With a woman he doesn't love anymore? It's an anchor. We have plans. We're going to Cabo in August. A crying infant doesn't fit the itinerary." "He's a father," Natalie snapped, clutching the rail tighter. "He loves this baby." "He loves me," Tiffany corrected, closing the distance. She was only 2 steps above Natalie now. And you're just a loose end. A very expensive loose end. Get away from me, Natalie warned, backing down a step. Her heel caught slightly on the rubber tread. She stumbled, but caught herself. Tiffany smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. It was the smile of someone who saw an opportunity. Oops, Tiffany whispered. It happened in slow motion, yet too fast to process. Tiffany didn't throw a punch. She didn't shove with 2 hands like a linebacker. She simply extended her arm, stiff and precise, and shoved Natalie's shoulder hard, just as Natalie was lifting her foot to take the next step. Natalie's center of gravity, shifted by the pregnancy, betrayed her. Her hand slipped off the rail. No, Natalie screamed. The world spun, ceiling, floor, wall. The sharp, brutal impact of marble against her hip, her shoulder, her head. She tumbled, unable to stop, her body a rag doll against the unforgiving stone. She tried to curl around her stomach to protect the baby, but the momentum was too violent. She hit the midway landing with a sickening thud. Silence. Natalie lay crumpled against the wall, her leg twisted at an unnatural angle. A warm, wet sensation began to spread down her legs. Blood. From the top of the stairs, Tiffany looked down. She didn't gasp. She didn't run for help immediately. She reached into her purse, pulled out a compact mirror, and checked her lipstick. Then, she screamed, "Help! Oh my God! Somebody help! She fell!" The emergency room at St. Francis Memorial Hospital was a blur of fluorescent lights and shouting voices. BP is dropping. Fetal heart rate is decelerating. We need to get her to the OR stat. Natalie was drifting in and out of consciousness. The pain was blinding, a white-hot fire consuming her lower body. Through the haze, she saw faces, doctors, nurses, police officers, and Greg. Greg was standing near the nursing station, talking to a police officer. Natalie tried to speak, tried to point a finger, but her arm felt like lead. She could hear him. "She's been very unstable, officer," Greg was saying, shaking his head, looking the picture of a distraught husband. "She's been having dizzy spells. I told her not to take the stairs. I begged her to wait for the elevator, but she was angry. She stormed off. And then, oh God." "And the witness?" the officer asked, scribbling in a notebook. "Miss Cole," Greg said, nodding toward Tiffany, who was sitting in a plastic chair, holding a cup of water with trembling hands. She followed Natalie to try and calm her down. She saw the whole thing. Natalie just missed a step. She tried to grab her, but it was too late. "Liar," Natalie tried to scream, but it came out as a whimper. She pushed me. A nurse leaned over her, placing an oxygen mask on her face. "Shh, honey, save your strength. We're taking care of the baby." Darkness took her. When Natalie woke up, the room was quiet. The rhythmic beeping of a monitor was the only sound. She blinked, her head throbbing. Her leg was in a cast, elevated in a sling. She moved her hand to her stomach. It was softer, smaller. A primal panic seized her chest. She scrambled to sit up, ignoring the agony in her ribs. "My baby! Where is my baby?" The door opened. It wasn't a nurse. It was Greg. He walked in, looking somber, but his eyes were cold. He closed the door behind him. "Greg," she choked out. "The baby, please." "Ideally, you should be resting," Greg said, his voice flat. "The baby is in the NICU, emergency C-section. He's barely 2 pounds, Natalie. His lungs are undeveloped. They don't know if he's going to make it through the night." Natalie began to sob, a raw, guttural sound. Tiffany pushed me. "Greg," she pushed me. "You have to tell them." Greg walked over to the bed. He didn't hold her hand. He leaned down, bringing his face close to hers. "Listen to me very carefully, Natalie," he whispered. "You fell. You were hysterical, you were clumsy, and you fell. Tiffany tried to save you. That is the truth. That is what the police report says. That is what the security guard, who heard you screaming, says." "No," she wept. "She pushed me. I saw her smile. Who is going to believe you?" Greg hissed. "You have a history of depression. You're on medication. I have the emails where you talked about feeling overwhelmed and wanting it all to end. I will use those, Natalie." If you try to pin this on Tiffany, I will paint you as a woman who tried to kill herself and her child. I will take full custody of that boy in the incubator, and you will never see him again. I have the money. I have the lawyers. You have nothing." He straightened up and adjusted his tie. "Now, get some rest. You have a long recovery ahead of you. I've already told the doctors you're confused from the anesthesia." He walked out. Natalie lay there, paralyzed by terror. He was right. Greg Pierce had connections everywhere. He played golf with the district attorney. He was a donor to the police fund. She was just a stay-at-home mom with no income and a history of postpartum anxiety from a miscarriage 2 years ago. She was alone, or so she thought. What Greg Pierce had forgotten, what he had arrogance enough to overlook, was that Natalie had a brother. She hadn't spoken to Harrison in 3 years, not since he told her Greg was a narcissist and she told him to go to hell. Harrison had moved to New York, burying himself in high-stakes criminal defense, becoming a legend in the darker corners of the legal world. He was known as the Wolf of Center Street. With shaking fingers, Natalie reached for the phone on the bedside table. She didn't call the police. She didn't call her parents. She dialed a number she knew by heart. It rang once, twice. Harrison Brooks speaking. "Make it quick. I'm in a meeting." "Harry," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Help me." There was a pause on the line. The shift in tone was instant. The cold, professional lawyer vanished, replaced by the big brother who used to beat up bullies for her on the playground. "Nat? Where are you? What happened?" "I'm at Street Francis," she sobbed. "Greg's mistress." And she pushed me down the stairs. "My baby is dying, and they're saying I did it to myself." A silence stretched over the line, heavier than before. When Harrison spoke again, his voice was terrifyingly calm. It was the voice of a man loading a gun. "Don't say another word to anyone. Not the doctors, not the cops, and especially not Greg. I'm getting on the next plane. I'll be there in 5 hours. Harry, they have witnesses. They have money." "I don't care what they have," Harrison said. "They just made the last mistake of their lives." Harrison Brooks did not run into the hospital. Men like Harrison didn't run. They stalked. He arrived at Street Francis Memorial 4 hours and 45 minutes after Natalie's call, wearing a charcoal 3-piece suit that cost more than the Honda Civic parked in the ambulance bay. He carried a leather briefcase in one hand and a cup of black coffee in the other. His face was a mask of terrifying neutrality, but his eyes icy blue, just like his sisters were scanning everything. He walked past the reception desk without stopping. When the security guard stepped forward to ask for ID, Harrison didn't slow down. He simply held up a gold-embossed card that identified him as a member of the New York State Bar and the Federal Defense League. "Family emergency. Room 412, Harrison said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried a frequency that made people instinctively step aside. He took the elevator to the ICU floor. The air here was heavier, thick with the scent of antiseptic and suppressed grief. He found room 412. Greg Pierce was standing outside the door, talking to a short, balding man in a cheap suit, presumably his own lawyer. Greg looked tired, his tie loosened, performing the role of the devastation-stricken husband for the nurses walking by. Harrison stopped 10 feet away. He set his coffee down on a cart. Greg looked up. The color drained from his face instantly. "Harrison?" "Gregory," Harrison said. He didn't offer a hand. He didn't blink. I didn't know you were coming," Greg stammered, straightening up. He nudged his lawyer, who looked confused. This is a surprise. Look, Harry, it's a tragedy. A complete nightmare. Natalie, she..." "Step away from the door," Harrison said. Greg blinked. "Excuse me? You are currently standing between my client and her legal counsel," Harrison lied smoothly. Natalie hadn't officially retained him yet, but Greg didn't know that. "If you do not move, I will have you removed by security for obstructing a federal attorney." Greg's lawyer stepped in, puffing out his chest. "Now wait a minute. Mr. Pierce is the husband. He has spousal rights. You can't just barge in here from New York and..." Harrison turned his gaze to the little man. "And who are you?" "I'm Arthur Miller. Mr. Pierce's family law attorney. Arthur, Harrison said, his voice dropping an octave. I'm going to give you some professional advice, free of charge. Walk away, right now, because in about 10 minutes, this is going to turn from a family law matter into a criminal investigation. And if you are standing next to him when the debris starts falling, you will get buried too. Arthur Miller looked at Harrison, then at Greg, then back at Harrison. He saw the predator in Harrison's eyes. He took a half step back. Greg, Arthur muttered, I'll go check on the paperwork downstairs. Arthur, Greg hissed, but his lawyer was already retreating toward the elevators. Now it was just the two of them. Greg's mask slipped. The grieving husband vanished, replaced by the arrogant tech bro who was used to buying his way out of problems. You can't scare me, Harrison, Greg sneered, lowering his voice. You don't know the whole story. Your sister is sick. She's mentally unstable. She threw herself down those stairs to manipulate me because she knew I was leaving her for Tiffany. Harrison moved. It was a subtle shift, just a lean forward, but it radiated violence. If you say her name again, if you even think the name, Tiffany, in my presence, I will dismantle your life, brick by brick. I won't just take your money, Greg. I will take your reputation. I will take your freedom. I will make you so toxic that even your mother won't return your calls. You have no proof, Greg challenged, though a bead of sweat trickled down his temple. It's her word against ours, and Tiffany saw everything. We'll see, Harrison said. He pushed past Greg and entered the room. Natalie was awake, staring at the ceiling. She looked small, broken, tubes and wires snaked around her arms. When she saw Harrison, her face crumpled. Harry, she whispered. Harrison closed the door and locked it. He walked to the bed, dropping the briefcase. The ruthless lawyer facade cracked, just for a second. He sat on the edge of the bed and carefully wrapped his arms around his little sister. She wept into his expensive suit, her tears soaking the wool. I've got you, he murmured into her hair. I'm here. She tried to kill the baby, Harry, Natalie sobbed. She looked me in the eye and she pushed me. Harrison pulled back, his hands gripping her shoulders gently. I believe you, but right now, I need you to stop crying and start fighting. We don't have time for grief. Not yet. Greg is outside spinning a narrative that you're suicidal. We have to kill that story before it takes root. He pulled a notepad from his pocket. I need details, every second. What shoes was she wearing? What did the floor look like? Where were the cameras? Who was around? Natalie took a shaky breath, wiping her eyes. It was the East Wing stairwell, between the 3rd and 4th floors. Nobody else was there, just us. Cameras? I think so. There's a dome on the landing. Harrison nodded, writing it down. Good. And the baby? Natalie's face fell. Leo. We named him Leo. He's in the NICU, Greg says. Greg says he's going to die. Greg is a liar, Harrison said firmly. I'm going to get the best neonatal specialist in the country on a video call within the hour. We're getting a second opinion. But first, we secure you. He pulled out a document from his briefcase. This is a temporary restraining order against Gregory Pierce and Tiffany Cole. I drafted it on the plane. I need you to sign it. Once you do, if they come within 100 feet of this room or the NICU, they go to jail. Natalie's hand trembled as she took the pen. He said he'd take Leo away. He said he has the emails where I complained about being tired. Let him try, Harrison said, watching her sign. He's playing checkers, Nat. I'm playing chess, and I never lose. As soon as the ink was dry, Harrison stood up. He walked to the door, opened it, and found Greg still lurking in the hallway, texting furiously. Harrison held up the paper. You've been served, Greg. Get out of my hospital. Greg squinted at the paper. What is this? Restraining order. Violation is a felony. You have 5 minutes to vacate the premises before I call the police and have you dragged out in cuffs in front of the nursing staff. I imagine that wouldn't look good for your company's stock price, would it? Greg's jaw clenched. He glared at Harrison with pure hatred. This isn't over. No, Harrison said, his voice cold as the grave. It's just beginning. The next morning, Harrison stood in the center of the San Francisco Superior Court atrium. It was 7 a.m., an hour before the courts opened to the public. He had called in a favor from an old law school buddy who was now a clerk for a federal judge in the district, getting him early access to the building. Beside him was Silas Vance. Silas wasn't a lawyer. He was a private investigator, but that title felt insufficient. Silas was an ex-forensic data recovery specialist for the NSA. He was a man who lived in the shadows of the internet. He wore a hoodie, jeans, and carried a backpack that contained equipment worth more than most houses. "Smell that?" Silas asked, chewing on a toothpick. "That's the smell of bureaucratic incompetence." "Focus, Silas," Harrison said, adjusting his cuffs. "We need the footage from Stairwell C between 2 and 2:30 p.m. yesterday." They walked to the security office in the basement. Harrison had already subpoenaed the footage overnight, a move that usually took days, but Harrison had threatened the court administrator with a negligence lawsuit regarding safety protocols if they delayed. The head of security, a tired-looking man named Officer Higgins, was waiting for them. He looked nervous. "Mr. Brooks," Higgins said, wiping sweat from his forehead, we got your request." "And?" Harrison asked, extending his hand for the drive. Higgins didn't hand anything over. He pointed to a bank of monitors. "We have a problem. The camera in Stairwell C. It's an old analog system. We were in the process of upgrading to digital." Harrison felt a cold knot form in his stomach. "Don't tell me it wasn't recording." "It was recording," Higgins said quickly, "but the file from that specific time block, it's corrupted. We had a power surge in the server room around 2:15 p.m. The system rebooted. There's a gap." "A gap," Harrison repeated, his voice dangerously low. "How long?" 12 minutes, Higgins whispered. "From 2:14 to 2:26, the exact time of the fall." Harrison slammed his hand on the desk, making Higgins jump. "You expect me to believe that in a government building, the cameras just happened to fail at the exact moment a woman was assaulted?" "It happens," Higgins pleaded. "Look, here's the log." Silas stepped forward. He hadn't said a word. He gently pushed Harrison aside and looked at the screen. His fingers flew across the keyboard. He hummed to himself. "It's not a standard corruption," Silas murmured. "See this timestamp? The file ends abruptly, but there's no jagged data edge. It's clean. Too clean." "What does that mean?" Harrison asked. Silas looked at the security guard. "It means someone didn't just pull the plug. Someone went into the system and deleted the index file so the player would skip it. This wasn't a glitch, Harry. This was an edit." Harrison turned his gaze back to Higgins. "Who had access to this room yesterday afternoon?" Higgins was shaking now. "Just me, and the night shift guy, and the maintenance crew." "Who is on the maintenance crew?" "We contracted out," Higgins said. "A company called Bay Area Facilitech." Harrison pulled out his phone. "Silas, get me everything on Bay Area Facilitech. I want to know who owns it, who works for it, and who they bank with." They left the security office, the air crackling with tension. Harrison was furious, but his mind was racing. This confirmed it. This wasn't just a crime of passion by a jealous mistress. This was a cover-up. Greg Pierce had reached out and scrubbed the tape. "He's smarter than I thought," Harrison muttered, as they walked back into the main lobby. He knew the cameras were there. He must have made a call immediately after the fall. "Or before," Silas suggested. "Maybe he planned it." "No," Harrison said. "Greg is reactive. He's a narcissist, not a hitman. He panicked and threw money at the problem. We need to find the person who took the money." They walked toward the exit, passing the spot where Natalie had sat the day before. Harrison stopped. He looked at the layout of the lobby. "Silas," he said, "look at the floor." "Marble," Silas noted. "Slippery when wet." "No. Look at the reflection." The floor was highly polished. The atrium was surrounded by glass walls. Across the street, there was a bank, a coffee shop, and a high-end hotel. "If the internal camera was wiped," Harrison said, pointing through the glass doors to the street, "what about the external world?" Silas followed his finger. Across the street, mounted on the corner of the Wells Fargo building, was an ATM camera. It was pointed at the sidewalk, but the angle, the reflection, Silas realized. The glass doors of the courthouse are tinted, but if the light was right, it was 2 p.m., Harrison said. Sun is in the west, hitting the front of the building. Silas grinned, the first real emotion he'd shown. If the doors were open, or even if they weren't, we might get a reflection of the lobby. It won't show the stairwell, though. No, Harrison said, turning back to the stairs. But look up. Above the stairwell entrance, there was a large brass chandelier. It was massive, a spherical, polished brass fixture. A convex mirror, Harrison whispered. You think the ATM camera across the street caught a reflection in the glass door, which caught a reflection in the brass chandelier, which showed the stairs? Silas asked, skeptical. That's CSI bullcrap, Harry. The resolution would be garbage. I don't need 4K, Harrison said. I just need to see two figures. I need to see one arm extend. I need to see the push. It's a long shot, Silas warned. It's the only shot, Harrison replied. Subpoena the bank footage. And Silas? Check Greg's financials. If he paid someone at the security company, there's a trail. He's arrogant. He probably Venmo'd the guy. Meanwhile, across town, in a penthouse overlooking the Bay Bridge, Tiffany Cole was sipping a mimosa. She was scrolling through Instagram, deleting negative comments. News of the accident had leaked to a few gossip blogs, but the narrative was holding. Troubled wife falls. Tragic. Greg walked in, looking pale. He threw his jacket on the couch. Harrison is here, Greg said, pouring himself a scotch. It was 10 a.m. Tiffany rolled her eyes. So? He's just a lawyer. You have lawyers. He's not just a lawyer, Tiff. He's a pit bull. He served me with a restraining order, and he was at the courthouse this morning with some tech guy. Tiffany put her drink down. Did you take care of the video? Yes, Greg said, pacing. I paid the guy 20 grand to corrupt the file. It's gone. But Harrison, he looked at me like he already knew. He's going to dig until he finds something. Tiffany stood up and walked over to him, wrapping her arms around his neck. Let him dig. There's nothing to find. It's her word against ours, and she's the crazy hormonal ex-wife. We win, Greg. We always win. Greg looked at her, and for the first time, he felt a flicker of revulsion. He saw the coldness in her eyes. But he was in too deep now. He had crossed the line. Yeah, Greg whispered. We win. But as he looked out the window at the city below, Greg Pierce had a sinking feeling that the game had changed. He wasn't playing against a broken wife anymore. He was playing against a man who had nothing to lose and everything to burn. And back at the hospital, in the NICU, a machine beeped. Little Leo Pierce, 2 pounds and 4 ounces, opened his eyes for the first time, and Harrison Brooks, standing by the incubator in a sterile gown, made a promise to the tiny, struggling life inside. Don't worry, kid, Harrison whispered, touching the glass. Uncle Harry is going to make them pay. While Natalie fought for her life in the ICU, Greg Pierce was fighting a different battle. The battle for the narrative. 3 days after the incident, Greg appeared on Bay Area Morning, the city's most popular breakfast news show. He wore a soft beige sweater instead of a suit, a calculated wardrobe choice to make him look softer, more vulnerable. He sat next to the host, his eyes rimmed with red, holding a tissue. It's been a nightmare, Greg said, his voice cracking perfectly on cue. Natalie has been struggling with severe postpartum depression since our miscarriage 2 years ago. I tried to get her help. I hired therapists. But when she found out I had moved on, she just snapped. The host, a sympathetic woman named Linda, leaned in. There are rumors, Greg, that her brother, the famous New York attorney Harrison Brooks, is claiming foul play. Greg looked down at his hands, shaking his head. Harrison is a shark. He sees every tragedy as a lawsuit. He wasn't there when Natalie was throwing plates at the wall. He wasn't there when she threatened to hurt herself if I left. He's grieving. I get that. But turning a family tragedy into a criminal circus? It's just cruel to our unborn son. In the hospital room, Natalie watched the TV mounted on the wall. She couldn't scream. Her throat was too raw, but tears streamed down her face. "Turn it off," Harrison said from the corner of the room. He didn't look up from his laptop. "Everyone believes him," Natalie rasped. "Look at the comments, Harry. They're calling me crazy, Natalie. They're saying I tried to kill my baby to punish him." Harrison stood up and walked over to the TV. He yanked the power cord out of the wall. "Let them talk," Harrison said, his voice dangerously calm. "Greg is winning the sprint. We are running a marathon. And he just made a fatal error." "What error?" "He gave a timeline," Harrison said. "On national television. He said you snapped when you found out he had moved on. But according to his affidavit, he claimed you didn't know about Tiffany until the moment you saw her at the courthouse. He just contradicted his sworn statement." Harrison's phone buzzed. It was Silas. "I'm outside." Silas's voice crackled. "You need to see this." The ATM footage was a bust, too blurry to see the push, but the timestamp gave us something else. "And I found the money." Harrison kissed Natalie on the forehead. "Rest. I have to go destroy a man's life." Harrison met Silas at a dive bar 3 blocks from the courthouse. It was dark, smelled of stale beer, and was the last place anyone would look for a high-powered attorney. Silas opened his laptop on the sticky table. "Okay, 2 things," Silas said, chewing on a stirrer. "First, the ATM footage. You were right about the reflection being garbage for detail. You can't see faces. But look at the bottom right corner." He pressed play. The grainy black and white footage showed the street. In the reflection of the glass doors across the street, a vague shape could be seen tumbling. "That's the fall," Silas said. "Timestamp, 2:18 and 3 seconds p.m. "Okay," Harrison said. So, Silas clicked to another window. "Here is the 911 call log. Tiffany Cole called emergency services at 2:24 and 15 seconds p.m. Harrison did the math instantly. 6 minutes. She waited 6 minutes to call 911? "Exactly," Silas grinned. "And here's the kicker. During those 6 minutes, there was another outgoing call from a cell phone pinging off the tower nearest the stairwell. Guess whose phone?" "Greg's," Harrison guessed. "Nope," Silas said. "Greg was in the courtroom. He had no service. The call came from a burner phone, but I traced the purchase of that burner to a credit card registered to a shell company called Apex Consulting." "And who owns Apex Consulting?" Silas turned the screen. "Tiffany Cole, but not the Tiffany Cole we know. It's registered to a Tiffany R. Davis's in Nevada." Harrison leaned in, his eyes narrowing. "Davis? Tiffany changed her name 4 years ago," Silas explained. "Before she was a lifestyle consultant in San Francisco, she was a bottle service girl in Las Vegas. And before that, she was a suspect in an insurance fraud case involving an elderly boyfriend who, get this, fell off a balcony." Harrison felt a chill run down his spine. This wasn't just a crime of passion. "Did he die?" Harrison asked. "No. He survived, but with severe brain damage. Couldn't testify. Tiffany walked away with a $500,000 settlement from his estate to avoid a lawsuit. She's a black widow, Harry. A pro." Harrison stood up, buttoning his jacket. "She's not a mistress. She's a predator. She targeted Greg. Greg is the mark," Silas nodded. "She needed Natalie out of the picture to get to Greg's trust fund. The baby was just collateral damage." "Send me everything," Harrison ordered. "I'm going to depose her tomorrow, and I'm going to rip her apart." The conference room at the law firm of Miller, Stein and Associates was freezing. It was a sterile glass box designed to intimidate. Tiffany Cole sat at the head of the table. She looked impeccable. She wore a modest navy dress, pearl earrings, and light makeup. She looked like a grieving friend, not a homewrecker. Greg sat next to her, holding her hand. Harrison sat opposite them. He had no assistant, no junior associates, just a stack of files and a video camera pointing directly at Tiffany's face. "Please state your name for the record," Harrison said, his voice flat. "Tiffany Cole." "Miss Cole," Harrison began, looking at a piece of paper, "you claim that on the date of the incident, you followed my client, Natalie Pierce, into the stairwell to comfort her. Is that correct?" "Yes," Tiffany said softly. "She was very upset. I just wanted to help." "You wanted to help, Harrison repeated. Interesting. Tell me, Miss Cole, do you have any medical training? No. CPR certification? No. So, when you saw a 7 months pregnant woman fall down 24 marble steps, your first instinct was to, what? Check her lipstick? Objection. Greg's lawyer, Arthur Miller, shouted. Argumentative. Withdrawn, Harrison said, not looking at Arthur. Let's talk about the timeline. You stated in the police report that you called 911 immediately. I did, Tiffany said, her eyes wide and innocent. I was screaming for help. The fall occurred at 2:18 p.m., Harrison said, sliding a printout across the table. You called 911 at 2:24 p.m. Can you explain what you were doing for 6 minutes while my nephew was suffocating inside his unconscious mother? Tiffany blinked. A flicker of annoyance crossed her face. I was in shock. Time moves differently when you're panicked. 6 minutes is a long time for panic, Harrison said. It's enough time to wipe a security server, for instance. Greg stiffened. I don't know what you're talking about, Tiffany said, her voice hardening. Harrison smiled. It was a wolf smile. Let's move on. Miss Cole, have you ever been to Las Vegas? Tiffany froze. Her hand, resting on the table, twitched. I visited. Who hasn't? Did you live there in 2019? I don't recall. You don't recall living in a city for a year? Harrison pulled another file. Let me refresh your memory. You lived at the Palms Place Residences with a Mr. Richard Gelson, 72 years old. Arthur Miller stood up. Objection. Relevance. What does this have to do with? It has to do with pattern and practice, Harrison snapped, slamming his hand on the table. Sit down, Arthur, or I'll report you to the bar for facilitating perjury. He turned back to Tiffany. The innocent act was slipping. Her eyes were cold daggers. Mr. Gelson fell off his penthouse balcony, Harrison said. Tragic accident. He survived, but he couldn't speak. You sued his estate for emotional distress and walked away with $500,000, and then you changed your name from Tiffany Davis to Tiffany Cole. Greg dropped Tiffany's hand. He looked at her, horror dawning on his face. Tiff? Is that true? He's lying, Tiffany hissed, but she didn't look at Greg. She was staring at Harrison with pure hatred. I have the name change petition right here, Harrison said, and I have the police report from Vegas. The detective noted that Mr. Gelson's railing had been tampered with, but they couldn't prove it. Harrison leaned forward. But here's the thing, Tiffany. San Francisco isn't Vegas, and I'm not a Vegas cop. I'm the guy who is going to put you in prison for attempted murder. You have nothing, Tiffany shouted, standing up. You have a glitchy camera and a fake story. Natalie fell because she's a clumsy, fat cow. The room went silent. The mask was completely gone. And there it is, Harrison said softly, the malice. Greg was staring at Tiffany as if she were a stranger. You said you loved me, he whispered. You said, oh, shut up, Greg, Tiffany snapped. Stop being such a weak little man. We're in this together. If I go down, you go down. You paid the security guard. Greg stammered, looking at the camera recording everything. I didn't. Harrison sat back, crossing his arms. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is what we call a confession. Arthur Miller had his face in his hands. The deposition is over, he mumbled. Oh, we're just getting started, Harrison said. Harrison walked out of the conference room feeling 10 feet tall. He had the recording. He had the confession on tape, Tiffany, implicating Greg in the bribery. It was enough to get the police to reopen the case. He pulled out his phone to call Natalie, but his phone was already ringing. It was the hospital. Mr. Brooks? It was Dr. Evans, the neonatal specialist. His voice was urgent. Yes? It's Leo, Dr. Evans said. He's had a pulmonary hemorrhage. His lungs are failing. We need to operate immediately, but because the baby is in Greg's custody technically, until the court order is finalized, we need the father's consent. I have a restraining order, Harrison shouted, running toward the elevator. The restraining order prevents physical proximity, the doctor said. It doesn't strip him of medical decision-making rights yet. We called Mr. Pierce, but he's not answering, Harrison swore. Greg was still in the conference room, likely arguing with his lawyer, probably ignoring his phone to avoid the press. "If we don't operate in the next 20 minutes," Dr. Evans said, "the baby will die." Harrison hung up. He didn't go to the elevator. He turned around and sprinted back toward the conference room. He kicked the door open. Greg and Tiffany were screaming at each other. Arthur was packing his briefcase. "You idiot!" Tiffany was yelling. "Why did you say anything?" "Greg!" Harrison roared. The room froze. Harrison walked up to Greg, grabbed him by the lapels of his $5,000 suit, and slammed him against the glass wall. "My son!" Greg gasped. "Your son is dying," Harrison snarled, his face inches from Greg's. "His lungs are bleeding out. The doctors are calling you. Pick up the phone." Greg's eyes widened. "What?" "Pick up the damn phone and authorize the surgery." Harrison shook him. "Right now." "Don't do it, Greg," Tiffany said from the table. She was checking her nails, though her hands were shaking. "If the baby dies, no heir, no custody battle. It simplifies things." Greg looked at Tiffany. Then he looked at Harrison. He saw the pure, unadulterated evil in the woman he had destroyed his marriage for. For the first time in his life, Greg Pierce saw himself in the mirror, and he hated what he saw. He reached into his pocket, his hands trembling violently, and pulled out his phone. He saw the missed calls from Street Francis. "Greg, don't," Tiffany warned. "Think about the alimony." Greg looked at her. "Go to hell." He hit dial. "Dr. Evans?" Greg choked out, tears finally spilling over. Real tears this time. "This is Greg Pierce. Save him. Do whatever you have to do. Save my son." He dropped the phone and slid down the glass wall to the floor, burying his head in his knees. Harrison stood over him, straightening his tie. He looked at Tiffany, who was now pale, realizing her hold was broken. "You better call your lawyer, Tiffany," Harrison said, "because the police are on their way, and this time, Greg isn't going to protect you." 6 months later, the San Francisco Superior Court was no longer a place of trauma for Natalie Pierce. It was an arena. The trial of the People versus Tiffany Cole had captivated the Bay Area. The tabloids called it the Staircase to Hell case. The courtroom was packed every single day. Natalie sat in the front row, looking nothing like the broken woman who had been wheeled out of this building on a stretcher. She wore a sharp, white blazer, her hair pulled back in a sleek ponytail. In her arms, sleeping soundly in a blue carrier, was 6-month-old Leo. He was small for his age, with a faint scar on his chest from the surgery, but he was alive. Beside her sat Harrison Brooks. He wasn't the attorney of record for the prosecution, that was District Attorney Elena Ruiz, but everyone knew who was really pulling the strings. Harrison had spent the last half-year systematically dismantling Tiffany Cole's life. He had flown to Nevada, interviewed old boyfriends, dug through trash cans, and deposed nurses. He had built a fortress of evidence so high it blocked out the sun. But Tiffany wasn't going down without a fight. She sat at the defense table, looking frail and modest. She had dyed her hair back to its natural brown and wore no makeup. Her defense strategy was simple and vicious: the Greg defense. She claimed she was a victim of Greg's coercive control, that he had ordered the hit, and she was too terrified to disobey. Greg Pierce, having lost his company, his reputation, and his dignity, had taken a plea deal in exchange for a reduced sentence of 5 years for obstruction of justice and conspiracy. He agreed to testify against Tiffany. Today was the day he took the stand. Greg looked like a ghost. His expensive suit hung loosely on his frame. He avoided looking at Natalie or the baby as he shuffled to the witness box. "Mr. Pierce," D.A. Ruiz began, pacing in front of the jury, "did you instruct Tiffany Cole to push your wife down the stairs?" "No," Greg whispered. I wanted a divorce. I wanted custody, but I never wanted violence." "Then why did you cover it up?" "Because she told me it was an accident," Greg said, his voice trembling. "She said," Natalie slipped, "I believed her. I loved her. I thought I was protecting the woman I was going to marry." "And when did you realize she was lying?" Greg looked up, his eyes finding Tiffany's. She stared back at him, her face a mask of icy contempt. When Mr. Brooks showed me the Vegas files," Greg said. When I realized I wasn't her partner, I was her mark. Tiffany's lawyer, a high-priced shark named Marcus Thorne, stood up for cross-examination. He tore into Greg, painting him as a weak, pathetic man who was throwing his lover under the bus to save his own skin. It was brutal. By the end of it, Greg was weeping openly. But Harrison wasn't worried. He leaned over to Natalie and whispered, "Watch this. The Hail Mary is coming." As the prosecution rested, Tiffany's lawyer stood up. "Your Honor, the defense calls Tiffany Cole." A gasp went through the room. It was rare for a defendant to testify. It was usually suicide. Tiffany walked to the stand with her head held high. She spoke softly, crying on cue. She told a story of Greg's rages, of his obsession with a clean break. She painted herself as a terrified girl caught in a billionaire's game. The jury looked sympathetic. She was good, terrifyingly good. Then came the twist. "Miss Cole," her lawyer asked gently, "is there another reason you were afraid of Mr. Pierce?" Tiffany placed a hand on her stomach. She looked directly at the jury, tears spilling over. "Yes, I'm pregnant. I'm carrying Greg's child." The courtroom erupted. The judge banged his gavel. Natalie felt the blood drain from her face. If Tiffany was pregnant, the jury might hesitate. They wouldn't want to send an expectant mother to prison. It was the ultimate sympathy card. Greg stood up, shouting, "She's lying! We haven't been together in 6 months." Harrison didn't shout. He didn't even blink. He simply reached into his briefcase and pulled out a single, red folder. He handed it to D.A. Ruiz, who looked at the contents, her eyes widening. Ruiz walked up to the witness stand for cross-examination. She held the folder against her chest. "Miss Cole," Ruiz said, her voice dangerously calm, "congratulations on your pregnancy." "Thank you," Tiffany sniffled. "It's a miracle, really," Ruiz continued. "Considering your medical history," Tiffany's eyes darted around the room. "I don't know what you mean." Ruiz slammed the folder onto the railing. "This is a medical record from the Las Vegas Rejuvenation Clinic, dated 4 years ago. It details a procedure, an elective tubal ligation. You had your tubes tied, Miss Cole? You cannot get pregnant naturally, so unless this is the second coming of Christ, you are lying to this court, to this jury, and to the father of your imaginary child." The silence in the courtroom was absolute. It was a vacuum, sucking the air out of the room. Tiffany's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The innocent, fragile act shattered instantly. Her face contorted into a snarl of pure, animalistic rage. "He made me do it," she screamed, pointing a shaking finger at Greg. "He said he'd cut me off. He said he'd ruin me. I did it for the money. I did it for the trip to Cabo. I hate him. I hate all of you." She stood up, looking like she was about to lunge at the prosecutor. 2 bailiffs tackled her back into the chair. "Sit down, Miss Cole," the judge roared. Harrison sat back in his bench, crossing his arms. He looked at Natalie. "Checkmate," he whispered. The verdict came back in under 2 hours. Guilty on all counts. Attempted first-degree murder, conspiracy, perjury. Because of the special circumstances, the vulnerability of the victim, and the premeditated nature of the attack, the judge showed no mercy. Tiffany Cole was sentenced to 25 years to life in a state penitentiary. As the bailiffs handcuffed her, she didn't look at Greg. She didn't look at the jury. She looked at Harrison. Her eyes promised revenge, but Harrison just stared back, his expression bored. To him, she was already a memory. Greg was sentenced a week later. He received 3 years in a minimum security facility. He lost his real estate license. His assets were frozen to pay for Natalie's medical bills and punitive damages. He was ruined. After the sentencing, Greg was allowed a brief moment with his family before being taken into custody. He walked over to where Natalie sat on the bench in the hallway. Harrison stood between them, a silent wall of muscle and wool. "Nat," Greg said, his voice hollow. Can I see him?" Natalie looked down at Leo. The baby was awake, his blue eyes staring up at the world with curiosity. "No," Natalie said softly. "Please," Greg begged. "He's my son." "You made your choice, Greg," Natalie said, standing up. She didn't sound angry anymore, She just sounded done. You chose her. You chose the lie. You chose to let me bleed on those stairs. You're not his father. You're just the donor. She turned to Harrison. Let's go home, Harry. Harrison nodded. He looked at Greg one last time. If you ever try to contact her, Harrison said, his voice low, remember that I'm only a phone call away. And next time, I won't use the law. I'll use my imagination. Greg watched them walk away. He watched his wife, his beautiful, strong wife, and his brother-in-law walk out of the courthouse doors and into the bright San Francisco sunlight. The heavy oak doors swung shut, leaving Greg alone in the shadow of the hallway. Outside, the air was crisp and smelled of the ocean. Natalie took a deep breath, the first one that didn't hurt in months. It's over, she said, looking at the city skyline. It's over, Harrison agreed. He checked his watch. My flight to New York leaves in 3 hours. I have a RICO case, starting on Monday. Natalie smiled, shifting Leo to her other hip. You're always working. Someone has to keep the wolves at bay, Harrison said, flagging down a taxi. He opened the door for her. But Nat? Yeah? I kept the file, Harrison said, looking at her seriously. Just in case. Natalie looked at her big brother, the terrifying, ruthless, brilliant lawyer who had dropped everything to save her life. She leaned over and kissed his cheek. I know, she said, but I don't think we'll need it. The Pierces are done. We're the Brooks family now. She got into the cab. Harrison got in beside her. As the car pulled away, merging into the traffic of the busy city, the courthouse grew smaller and smaller in the rear window until finally it disappeared. Gravity had done its worst, but love, fierce, protective, sibling love, had proven to be the stronger force. And that is how the fall of the Pierce dynasty came to an end. It wasn't the police, and it wasn't luck that saved Natalie and baby Leo. It was the unbreakable bond of family and a brother who refused to let the truth be buried under money and lies. This story reminds us that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room isn't the one holding the weapon, but the one holding the checkbook. But even money can't buy silence when a wolf is at the door. What would you have done if you were Harrison? Would you have let Greg off with a plea deal? Or would you have gone for total destruction? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story of justice, betrayal, and revenge, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a new episode of Courtroom Chronicles. Until next time, stay safe and watch your step.